So, as Vince was saying, we are still early on in our journey of going through Joshua and taking the land. And this morning, we're looking at chapter 2. And if you remember, slightly confusing, 2 weeks back when Vince was doing chapter 1, it's packed full of promises that God spoke to Joshua. So just really quickly in chapter 1, verse 3, I will give you every place where you set your foot. Verse 5, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. And verse 6, you will lead these people to inherit the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. So that's just some of the backdrop of chapter 1 I just want to remind you of as we now look at chapter 2. So just to briefly kind of summarize what happens in chapter 2, for those of you who, like myself, couldn't necessarily regale every detail. So verse 1, it starts with Joshua secretly sending 2 spies to, it says, to go and look over the land, especially Jericho. This is the land that has been promised to Israel. So these 2 spies, they head off to Jericho, and they find themselves at the home of a lady called Rahab. Now, somehow, it doesn't say how, but somehow the king of Jericho gets wind that there are some spies in his city. So he sends a messenger to go and challenge Rahab. However, Rahab hides the spies, and she denies knowing anything about them to these messengers of the king. The messengers then go on wherever they go back to. And in verse 9 to 11, Rahab says to the spies, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Skipping on a tiny bit. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So Rahab puts her life on the line for these 2 strangers, these 2 men. Why? Why would she do that? I think because of that last verse, she had a revelation that the God of Israel is the true God. Rahab then goes into negotiation with the spies and gets them to agree that when they come and take the land, when they come to Jericho, that they will spare both her and her family for what she's done with these spies. And they agree some of the technicalities, so she pops the red cord out of her window. And this is honoured in chapter 6, whoever's got that, I'm sure they'll cover it, but it's honoured by Joshua and the 2 spies, what they negotiate. Verse 22, 23, the spies then leave Jericho, they escape, they go and hide in the hills for a few days before heading back home to give report back to Joshua. And verse 24, it ends with them reporting back to Joshua. And they say, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All of the people are melting in fear because of us. That is a good report for him to give back. So before I dive into my main points, I just want each one of us, and I mean each one of us, to have in mind, what is the land that you are preparing to take? And in a room of this size, that's probably going to be so many different things to each one of us. So it might possibly be a community group or something that you're reaching out to. It might be your street, your neighbours. It could be a physical property or a piece of land. It might be a new geographical location that God is calling you into. It might be a new place of service or ministry. It might be a dream that God birthed in you years and years ago, maybe decades ago. When Vince spoke a few weeks ago, he talked about that this land could actually be internal. It might be land that you want to take back in your heart or your mind, that the enemy has perhaps had a foothold in for a long time. It might be anger, fear, bitterness, trauma, the list could go on there, but it might be something that you are saying, no, I'm taking back this land in my heart. It's possibly a physical healing. You may have had a condition or something that you've lived with for years, for decades, and you're like, no, this land is coming back to me. Or just as literally Nigel was, wherever he's gone, was prophesying over you guys, some people are real intercessors who are very prophetic, and they see, and the land that they are preparing to take is very much in the spiritual realm. So that's just some examples, just to give you a flavour that whatever your land is, it will look different to others. But please have in mind, as I'm just going through this, what your land is. So with every talk I do, I'm like, God, what do you want to say? Please help. And he gave me 3 points that I really felt he wanted to kind of draw through this morning to us. So the first one is prepare, plan. Joshua had some amazing, really clear promises spoken over him that he would see the land taken. Just again, verse 3, I will give you every place you set your foot. Verse 5, no one will be able to stand against you. So why did he feel the need to send these spies into the land? If he'd received these amazing promises, were they not enough just to go, all right, let's go? But Joshua was a wise military leader, and he was simply gathering information about his enemy, the condition of their morale. He was being prepared. He was planning to take the land. And even though I believe Joshua was standing on those amazing promises that he had earlier on, he was also playing his part. If you think about the land that you are preparing to take, absolutely lean on the promises that you've had. Declare them, thank God for them. But also ask God, what can I do to plan? What can I do to prepare to take the land? Listen for his strategy. I'm just, whilst I do this, weaving just some of our testimony of how we've seen God work in our lives in this area. So in terms of planning and preparing, we've been married for nearly 20 years. I can't believe I'm actually old enough to have been married for that long. Well, obviously, with you. And we've, over those 20 years, we've lived in different geographical locations. But for us, ever since we were engaged, we were like, God, where do you physically want us to live? For us, where we lived and moved was never about a job or family. Not, please hear me, that there's nothing wrong with that. It was just, we were like, Father, where do you want us to live? And he always led us. Vince just briefly touched on the most recent kind of move we made. So yeah, when we were engaged a long time ago, he led us to a county I'd never really heard of, Northamptonshire, to a town I'd definitely not heard of, Daventry, to help lead a small little church plant there. And again, Milton Keynes, Malawi, here, everywhere. He has helped us in our planning and preparing. He's told us clearly where he wants us. Even in some of the smaller detail, once we've had the where, in terms of, for example, the town or the country, okay, Father, exactly which house do you want us to live in? We love looking around houses, don't we? I don't know why. But our current house, even before we viewed it, God told us separately, this is the house that you are going to live in. We only viewed one house to our disappointment. We could have happily looked around loads, but we were just like, well, this is it. There's no point wasting time looking at others as much as we would have enjoyed it. And that day we viewed it, we put an offer in because we knew it was ours. Then ensued a bit of a battle. It looked like we nearly lost it at one point, but we just kept standing on, no, we really feel we heard you, God. We're just going to believe when we lost our buyer that there's another one around the corner. And we got that house and it's perfect. So what have we kind of learnt through that, some of that planning or preparing as we've had those geographical moves? For us, intimacy with Father, listening to his voice, his guidance. Father, what do we need to do to plan and prepare to move into that land. I think you may have touched on this verse in your preach, Vince, Exodus 33:11. Then the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young-aged Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. For me, that speaks of Joshua's understanding of the importance of the presence of God, of spending time with him and intimacy and listening with him. So whatever your land is, as you're planning and preparing for it, plan with God. Spend time with him in his presence and listen to him for his guidance and strategy. Second point, divine connections. Rahab in this story. The two spies were going to Jericho. They didn't know where they were going to go in Jericho, and they certainly didn't know who they were going to meet, where they would end up staying. But God had already, in advance, planned that divine connection for them with Rahab. And Rahab was a really important person for these spies. Firstly, she shared really important information with them. She protected them from the messengers of the king. She hid them, and she also, as they were leaving, advised them, this is the best place for you to hide whilst they're still looking for you. So my point is, expect divine connections if they are needed in whatever your land is. Our experience so far is that God is the best connector in the world. If you need connecting with certain people for taking your land, he will do it. Again, just drawing on some of our experience of where we've seen this. When we moved to Malawi beginning of 2016, but before we could move there, we needed a visa to be able to live there. In order to get a visa, you need an organization in that country to sponsor that visa for you. So we knew we needed some kind of connection. We looked at the missionary agencies, but we just didn't fit in their boxes. What we wanted to do, we just wouldn't fit in their mold. We just knew we couldn't. It just wasn't right for us, so we didn't look there. I don't have time to share the whole story, but our last trip before we moved, we connected through a friend with a Christian hospital in the capital city who we met with their directors, and they offered you a part-time voluntary role, finance. He's not a doctor, finance. And they were like, you'll get your visas that way. It's part-time, so you've got the rest of the week to do your ministry, and we'll possibly, if we can, perhaps pay your rent on a home. So we went home, great. It's all falling into plan. So we sold our house, which sold before it came on the open market. We handed in our notices at work. We started to get rid of our belongings. And then total bolt out of the blue, the offer as it had been presented to us was removed and an alternative was given, and we just knew it wasn't right. So it was a total shock, not necessarily delivered in the most reflective of the Father's heart, shall we say. So we were a bit like, oh, what's going on here? And the sensible thing might have done to retract our notices at work, pull out of the house sale, but we were like, no, we know God has promised. He's told us the month that we are moving, which was literally months away at this point. But we just knew that our land was Malawi for this next season. So we clung on to those promises that we'd had spoken over us. And in faith, we carried on the house sale. We carried on working on notices. We carried on getting rid of our belongings. In the meantime, I don't know, I should have got timescales, but a month or two-ish later, I had a invitation from an ex-social worker colleague of mine who is Malawian, who had set up this charity in Malawi, which was around raising the quality of standard of training social workers. And she was arranging like an annual networking event in London for people who were in England training social workers who might want to help and partner. And she was like, please come, Laura, please come. And I was like, I really don't want to. I didn't tell her this, but I was like, I have no passion for social work. Yeah, I shouldn't have said that really. No, as in, what do I mean by that? Yeah, I quickly figured out that social work doesn't, you need God to solve the problems, not social work. Anyway, but we knew I wasn't going to Malawi to do social work. So I was like, no, I don't want to get entangled with that. And anyway, she was persistent, bless her. She was like, oh, look, come, look. A lot of these people have never been to Malawi. You have. There's so much you can perhaps share. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll take a day off work and I'll go into London. And it was with some reluctance, wasn't it? And then I got off the train in London. It was one of those grey, sopping wet days. I was like, oh, why am I here? Taking a day's holiday to come to wet London. Anyway, there was only about 30 people there, so we all introduced ourselves. I don't know, I teach social work at this uni. Got to me, well, I'm moving to Malawi in a few months in blind faith. And they had a guest speaker there who was a trustee of a project in Blantyre in the south of the country, and she did this wonderful presentation of what their project did. And I was like, well, that looks amazing, but I don't really care. It's got nothing to do with me or what we're going to do. Anyway, she grabbed me at the end. She said, oh, you're moving to Malawi. I'd love a social worker with that training experience to come and help in our... So I politely listened. I was like, no, I'm really sorry, but not for me. Plus, we're not looking at that part of the country and whatever. So she was just making small talk, and she's like, well, what does your husband do? So I have accountancy, finance. Oh, we're looking for an accountant as well. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I shouldn't just totally ignore this woman. So I took her card, and I don't have time for the full story, but we were like, we really should explore this opportunity. And so we went up and met with the other directors, and they basically were like, please, we'd love to have you. You can do, we don't normally offer part-time, but we know that you've got a heart for ministry, so you can do part-time. We know this is just a stepping stone for you into what longer term stuff. And she wasn't even a Christian, was she? But she kept saying, look, we don't normally do this, but for you guys we will. And we were just like, wow. So we went and had a fried breakfast, didn't we? And we're like, God, is this you? And he said yes. And it was a perfect way in. We managed to reduce our part-time hours to even less part-time hours. And yeah. It was just a perfect, but my point is, it was a total God connection. Like the thing that we had kind of engineered, it totally fell through, and we literally just had to rely on this God connection of me reluctantly going to London to this thing where I met the person who opened up the door for us to go. And then during our first 6 months there, God just connected us again with just totally the right people in terms of ministry. We had no contacts there. We'd never even been to the city until we moved there. But he just connected everything. On a really practical thing about a home there. So there's no right move in Malawi. It's all about who you know. And we knew nobody. And we weren't on a huge budget because we were missionaries. The salary's not usually great. But we knew we wanted to live in a safe part of the city. We knew we wanted to kind of relax. So God had spoken to us a few times that our home was going to be an oasis, not just for us, but for others. And actually feeling, you don't think about it here, but actually feeling safe in your own home is actually really important. But the safe parts of the city were out of our budget. So we looked around some horrendous properties. We were like, oh, there's the sky. We can look at the stars at night. And like, oh, where's the floor? And some really dirty. They're like, oh, you're from the West. And they put another zero on the end. And anyway, and we just felt like we were getting nowhere, hitting a brick wall. Like, God, please, we want to feel somewhere safe with a roof and a floor. And anyway, oh, it's a different world. And so a Malawian friend got in touch. He'd moved from the part of the country we knew to where we were living. And he said, oh, I've seen this house like on a Malawian WhatsApp network. And he connected us with the owners. And we went and viewed it because it was in one of the best parts of the city in terms of safety. And it was perfect. It was a normal house, because normally out there they're huge. It was just a 3-bed semi. Semis are extremely rare. The rent was just amazingly low. I'll jump to the end. We get the house, but people were like, "Your rent's that low?" They couldn't believe it. We had the most amazing landlord, Malawian landlord, which, having been a landlord in England, there's so many rules. You've got to really look after the place. Out there, no. But he was just a godsend, wasn't he? He'd lived in England for a bit, so we understand British humour, which that is a miracle. So we just had the most amazing relationship with him. We felt so safe because it was in a safe part of the city. The president's private house was just at the end of our road. The rest of our street, there was like MPs and stuff. So generally the robbers are not going to go for that street. With it being a semi, we had 2 sets of different neighbours there. Both of them were Christian, had amazing relationships. And it was, we were even talking about it yesterday, weren't we? It was just so perfect in every single way. But it came through that divine connection of our friend thinking of us being part of a kind of world of connections that we were never going to be part of. And we just got an amazing house. So as you're thinking of your land, it might not be another country in a city where you have to think about being safe. But if you need a divine connection, then he will have already put it in place. I'm not saying don't just sit and wait for them to fall on your lap. Like, we were still trying to do what we could, but our efforts were in vain. I think because he was making a point. Well, look what I can do. So if you need divine appointments, connections, relationships, he can and will do it. Final point. The enemy knows that you are coming to take the land, and he is melting in fear. So Jericho was the first major city that the Israelites would encounter, and Joshua knew that they would face opposition. But let's remind ourselves of what Rahab said to the spies in verse 9 to 11. I know that the Lord has given you this land, and a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So the enemy knows that we are coming. He knows that you are preparing to take whatever your land is, and he's melting in fear. I love that. So let's just remember who our enemy is. Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. We might not, hopefully, be called to physically take a city like Jericho anymore, but our enemy is the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, as Paul said in Ephesians. 1 John 4:4 says that the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. That's why our enemy is trembling in fear. I love the worship song, Awake My Soul. One of the lines is, and when he moves, as in God, when God moves, make no mistake, the bowels of hell begin to shake. Love it. Verse 11 again. We heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God. The enemy knows who your God is. He knows who is living inside of you. He knows that we are preparing to take the land, and he's not happy. I love it in Psalms where it talks about God laughing at his enemies. There's a guy I've forgotten his name there. Let's laugh at that guy. what's it called? Igniting, yeah. He's just like, let's just laugh at that. Let's just laugh at the enemy's attempts, whatever he throws at us. And you're like, oh, yes. Now, for us personally, we love to kind of see people get delivered and set free. And that's really why we're wanting to do this Freemasonry Day, because we want people to be free, as Marianne shared that amazing testimony. And that's, for us, that's part of our land that we want to be taking in the spiritual realm. We want that land to be taken for the kingdom of God. And I was just doing a bit of research about, I'm just using this Freemasonry as an example, but it's rife around here. There's lodges in Axminster, Lyme, Seaton, Honiton, Sidmouth, Chard, Crewkerne, Budley, Exmouth, Exeter, and that's just the local ones. So there is a bit of a spiritual stronghold of this in this area, but we're all here. This guy is coming down to the southwest to begin to see this shift and to take this land in the spiritual realm. Now, the enemy doesn't like it. Since we started to kind of advertise it this month, there's been a bit of a backlash because he's terrified. He's melting in fear. So he's going to be throwing his toys out of the pram and see if you like this. But it's because he knows, he's heard that report from the spies, that they're fearful. Because Jesus is victorious. He defeated the enemy at the cross. Last week, we weren't totally skiving. We were at another church, and there was a time when I had both of my hands in worship, and I just out of the blue had this picture of me, and I was holding this big kind of ball of fire, and it was being thrown into the enemy's land, and I just felt it was God encouraging us as we were getting a bit of a prod from the enemy. It's because he can see this big ball of fire that we're about to start to kind of throw into hell. So let's terrorize hell. Let's take the land. Let's claim whatever our land is for the kingdom of God, because as that song said, the bowels of hell are shaking. They know that you're coming. They know that we, River Church, are coming. And they're melting in fear, just as Jericho was. So whatever your land is, prepare, plan with God, strategize with him, expect divine connections if you need them. And I'm not saying not to try and make those connections yourself, but he will make the best connections for you. And finally, the enemy, he knows you're coming. He knows that we are coming. He knows that we're coming to take that land and that it's ours, it's been promised to us, and he is melting in fear. So let's just remind him who lives in us, what he knows. Amen. That's it.